Hey everyone, welcome back to class. We're here for another great day of the history of rock and roll, and today we are starting with one of my favorite time periods, the British invasion of the mid 1960s. We're here. I know a lot of you have been looking forward to this. This is considered to be, one of the great periods of rock and roll history. And we're going to start off with a group that you simply must talk about when you talk about this era. They're really, when you get right down to it, they're the most influential group of this time period, and maybe of all time. And I'm talking, of course, about the Beatles. So let's talk about them. So in 1961, when Brian Epstein discovered the Beatles, they were doing covers of 1950s American rock and roll standards. We've mentioned this in the past, I think, at least in passing, that these British groups were inspired to play by the American rock and rollers of the 1950s. So who are these people? These are people who we've already learned about. We're talking about Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, and many others, right? That we've mentioned. So it's this 1950s American rock scene that inspires this new generation of British rockers who are going to be coming over here, right? Just like I just said, early influences were Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, and others. Okay, so in 1962, the Beatles get a new drummer, uh, replacing their old drummer of Pete Best, a man named Richard Starkey, who would use the stage name of Ringo Starr. And something happens in 1962. In addition to some of their um, covers, their covers of American 1950s and early 60s rock songs, they start to do some originals written by the two leaders of the group, John Lennon and Paul McCartney. These are songs that led to early success for the Beatles. Songs like Please Please Me, From Me to You, and She Loves You. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Moving on. All right, so let's talk about the phenomenon known as Beatlemania. As you could probably guess, this is where they become the most popular. They were little known outside of the UK in the early 60s. But when we start to get to the mid 60s, they become immensely popular, and here's really how that happens. So here they are in an early performance on the Ed Sullivan Show, a name who we have mentioned a few times before. So in January of 1964, the Lennon and McCartney original song, I Want to Hold Your Hand, reaches number one, all the way to number one on the pop charts, which was unusual for a non-American group to have a number one song on the American charts. But the Beatles did it with I Want to Hold Your Hand. In February of 1964, so just 1 month later, they debut on the Ed Sullivan Show, their first ever performance in the United States. And I'm going to link below their appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. what you'll notice is not only their music, but the accompaniment of throngs of screaming teenage girls. This is followed the Beatles around um, for pretty much all of their early career, and until their fans started getting a little bit older. But um, when you look at this early footage of the Beatles, you can always, if it's live, you can always be sure that there's going to be screaming people in the audience, and that's what you see here. So in just really 1 month, the Beatles are able to get all of this fanatical support, right? And so, but when they come here, just 1 month later, after they get their #1 song, there's a big welcome party waiting for them. They're an instant success. The British invasion has now begun. This is considered to be the start of the British invasion. The Beatles were so popular, and their performance on the Ed Sullivan Show did so well that people started looking at other bands from England. More bands from England started to come over, and almost just because they were British, they started to have a ton of success. You even had certain bands who, were not really bands. They were just, record companies would, say like, hey, we need to get four handsome guys in suits or in mock turtlenecks or whatever, put some instruments in their hands, and we'll see if we can capitalize on this craze. And for some of those bands, they did get some level of success. Not as high as the Beatles, but they were able to get a hit record here and there. Bands like that, and so what we're going to see here in the British invasion is that there are going to be several different types of bands. There are going to be bands that uh, are around for a short time but have a lasting impact. There are going to be bands that are going to be around for a long time after the 1960s. And there are going to be some bands that are very forgettable, some who wrote, pretty forgettable music, but maybe fit into the time period well. And you're going to see some bands that maybe we don't appreciate as much in our modern day, but if you take a look back at their songs, they're really great songs that hold up. And there's all different sorts of these types of bands, and we'll talk about some of them um, in this presentation, and also not this presentation per se, but in this unit, and also in your project, which will be coming up very shortly. I'll give you some more information about that another time. Okay, so 1965 here, going ahead a year. This is a very big year for the Beatles, 1965. So let's talk a little bit about what was going on with them. So the Beatles have their film debut with the movie A Hard Day's Night, which was a big financial success for them at the box office. And the soundtrack, the album by the same name, was also very, very successful as well. So you'll see this a lot. We saw this actually kind of with Elvis, right? He'll be in a movie, and then he'll have music that goes with the movie, and he'll get to sell his movie tickets, and then he'll also get to sell records that are associated with the movie. And that's kind of that cross promotion that Elvis did, and the Beatles are doing that here too, because you know they were such huge stars that people just wanted to see them whenever they could, and if it was going to be in a movie, then it was going to be in a movie. Sorry. Um, let's see here. So I'm going to link below a clip from A Hard Day's Night. Um, there are some, it's pretty funny, but you know, British humor is a little bit different from American humor. It's a little more dry, a little bit more ironic or sarcastic. So as you watch this, you know, try to pick out some of the things that they're saying here. You know, this is a fictional account, this movie, but it's kind of based in reality. It's based on when the Beatles came over and they were such a big success, and now they're being interviewed by the British press about you know how they're doing in America, and you know what they think of their new success. And the Beatles in this movie give very funny answers. But remember, it's just a movie, right? Okay. All right. As I just said, the soundtrack to Help. Oh, Help also reached the top of the charts in 1965. So actually, there are two movies in 1965 that the Beatles really you know, hit it out of the park with. There was first A Hard Day's Night, and then Help, and the two albums that came out in support of those movies both did very well. And if that wasn't enough, they also come out with the album Rubber Soul, which you know there are you know different people consider different albums to be you know the best Beatles album, but many do consider Rubber Soul to be the best. It's a personal favorite of many people. So this is their first album of all original material. That's an important note. Before that, they would have mostly original material, but then they would kind of fill it out with some 1950s and early 60s covers. Look at the song Twist and Shout for as an example of that, and also look for Roll Over Beethoven, which we know is a Chuck Berry song that the Beatles covered as well. So now, 1965, they have their first album of all original material, and some of the big hits off this album are Norwegian Wood, Nowhere Man, Michelle, and In My Life I've Loved Them All. You know I can't do a video without singing to you guys. Okay, now this also established John Lennon and Paul McCartney as the preeminent pop songwriting team of their generation. They're kind of like a rock and roll Gilbert and Sullivan, if you know who those guys are. And of course, I don't have to say that the Beatles are one of the most influential bands of all time. Just look at the list of people who list them as an influence. And by the way, these are their contemporaries. We're talking about guys like Bob Dylan, Frank Zappa, Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys, the Rolling Stones. These were people who were creating music at the same time as the Beatles, but were simultaneously competing with them and being influenced by them. It's kind of a beautiful thing. There's the album cover for Rubber Soul right there. It just popped up. All right, 66 to 67. A little bit of a different look for the Beatles here. If you want, rewind a little bit in this video and take a look at what they looked like on the Ed Sullivan Show. Take a look at the album cover for Rubber Soul, and now look at this picture. A different look here. They got the facial hair going. You know, the hair, the fashion is a little bit different. That's gonna play a part here. This is them in 1967, and there is the very famous album cover for the album that we're going to be talking about now, which is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. If you remember, I mentioned this when we talked about the Beach Boys. what an influential album this was. And that's them on the cover. You might, it's a little small, so maybe you want to like just Google Sgt. Pepper's album cover so you can see it farther up close. And what you'll see here is the Beatles in the front and center in this like neon colored, uh, old-timey, uh, like British military uniforms, right? And then just to the your left, right? Just to the left, you'll see the Beatles from 1964, right? Like that's what they used to look like. And then, there are many, many different famous faces around them. Some are, popular, some are more obscure, but these are people who the Beatles were being influenced by. You have guys up there like Edgar Allan Poe is up there. Um, you have guys like the uh, the avant-garde experimental classical music composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen is one of the faces in there. Bob Dylan is one of the faces up there. Um, uh, Karl Marx, actually, believe it or not, is one of the faces up there. So there's a lot of famous figures who are famous for different things. So let's talk about this album. In July of 1967, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band appeared in record stores everywhere, and is considered one of the most influential and frequently discussed albums of the 1960s, and I would even say of all time. After Sgt. Pepper's, this is the Beatles start to kind of wind down their careers. Um, Before we get off of Sgt. Pepper's, because we just talked about it for a little bit, I have to say that back when when we were allowed to go and see concerts, I went to go see at NJPAC in Newark a performance of the entire Sgt. Pepper's album played by a Beatles cover band. What was the name of that band? Do you remember? I think it was called Classical Mystery Tour. So it was played by this Beatles cover band called Classical Mystery Tour and the New Jersey Symphony Orchestra backing them up. And they played the entire Sgt. Pepper's album from the first song all the way through to the last song. Man, it was so awesome. So actually, you might want to check that out. Maybe I'll post a link if I remember to, but if I don't, Google Classical Mystery Tour. This band goes all over the country and plays with whatever city they're in. They play with that city's orchestra, and they do these Beatles songs, and it's so much fun, and it's so awesome to hear these songs with the full orchestra. It's really, really cool. Okay. Also, after Sgt. Pepper's, this is the last album that they recorded and toured with. After this, they devoted all of their energy to being a studio band, to creating albums, but they only did a couple of live performances after this album came out. The reason being is because there was some infighting in the group. This is something that happens when um, you get a lot of creative people together. Different people have ideas, but the thing about working with in a band, it's like a little family. And in your family, I'm sure not everyone gets what they want all of the time. And for like super, super creative people, that can be really frustrating because it means they're always having to compromise on their ideas. Um, and there was outside factors too. Don't want to get too much into it, but you might have heard about John Lennon's wife, Yoko Ono, playing a part in driving him away from the members of the band and things like that. So there were some issues personally with between members of the group. Um, so they were that they didn't really like being around each other for during this time, which is another reason why they stopped touring and only created records together. And then in 1968, their manager Brian Epstein died. Now this was sad because they all liked Brian Epstein, but it was also sad because Brian Epstein was kind of a person who would you know uh, resolve a lot of the conflicts that were in the group. And when he was gone, he was kind of like the glue that was holding the group together. And now with him gone, there's only it was only a matter of time before the Beatles broke up. So let's talk about this end of an era. Okay. So we're going to see some album covers here. These are the albums that came out after Sgt. Pepper. First, we have the Magical Mystery Tour. Remember, I just talked about that band, the Classical Mystery Tour. This is where they got their name. It's kind of a pun. There's the Yellow Submarine. And then probably, I've been saying this a lot, but this probably is the most iconic album cover of all time. This is the album cover to Abbey Road, of them crossing the street just outside of Abbey Road Studios, where this album and so many other albums, not just by the Beatles, but by some of the greatest acts in history, have recorded albums at Abbey Road Studios. And this is them crossing the street there. You can go, well, you used to be able to go and see this place, and one day soon you will get to do it again, I'm sure. But it's a big tourist attraction now. People take their photos. They try to recreate this album cover, much to the chagrin of the people who live on the street, who are always getting stuck in traffic as someone tries to get just the right angle for their Instagram. You know how it can be. All right. Anyway, at the end of the decade, they had were having a lot of success despite the conflicts and despite the not touring. This included Magical Mystery Tour, Yellow Submarine, and Abbey Road, as we mentioned, and also the White Album, which is also a lot of people's favorite album from the Beatles. In 1969, Paul McCartney wrote the song "Hey Jude," which was a song written to Julian Lennon, who is John Lennon's son. He is the Jude here. Didn't want to use his real name for the song, but it's in support of him, who was going through a hard time because his parents, John Lennon and Yoko Ono, were also going through a hard time. So it was in support of Julian Lennon, who went by the nickname Jude. Okay, and by the end of 1970, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison had all released solo albums. The only person who hadn't released a solo album by the end of 1970 was Ringo Starr. His solo album would come out later. So, they all recorded solo albums. But, this kind of spelled the end for the Beatles. They were all writing their own music, recording it on their own, and releasing it. Fun little trivia fact. You could ask your friends the question, where did the Beatles break up? Where did the Beatles break up? Anyone know? Well, Mrs. DeJoseph is off screen playing video games, raising her hand because she knows it's okay. Everyone, we're all playing video games these days. But anyway, where did the Beatles break up? You might be surprised to hear that one of the saddest days in rock and roll history occurred at the happiest place on earth, Walt Disney World in Orlando, Florida, specifically at the Polynesian Resorts, which is one of my favorite resorts. I don't stay there, but um, I like to go eat there, and I like the whole atmosphere there. Um, but uh, but this is where the Beatles broke up. Well, how? Well, you see, to disband the group, there was all this paperwork that needed to be signed. There was all this legal mumbo jumbo, right? How are we going to split future revenue from our old albums that get sold, and different things like that. So paperwork had to be signed, lawyers needed to get involved, and the paperwork was all signed except one person had not yet signed, and that one person was John Lennon, who was on vacation at Disney World with his family. So he got the paperwork there, and he was the last Beatle to sign, and that was the official end of the one of the greatest groups of all time, the Beatles. Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to do it for us today. In our next class, we will learn about three other bands who are not the Beatles, but were part of the British invasion and were quite successful and even had a lengthier tenure than the Beatles did. You think about it, the Beatles, they're you know from from the height of their popularity, from uh, their debut on the Ed Sullivan Show to when they disbanded, that's only like 6 years, you know. So, but there are these other bands that lasted way longer. Some of them are even still touring today, which is crazy, right? So we'll talk about. I don't want to mention who they are right now, but I don't want to mention who they are right now. But you'll see who I'm talking about next time. All right, folks. Make sure you listen to the listening examples that I post, and make sure you take a look at the assignment that you need to hand in today. Folks, have a great day. Take care and comb your hair. Goodbye.